The auction block in the Roman Forum was packed with buyers examining the latest cargo from Gaul. Among the prisoners of war stood a 15-year-old girl, whose fate would be decided not by her skills or intelligence, but by her appearance alone. The auctioneer forced her to spin slowly, highlighting her youth and beauty to drive up the price. Within minutes, she sold for 20 times the cost of a farm labourer. Her buyer wasn't looking for someone to cook or clean. He ran one of Rome's 45 licensed brothels, and she would spend the rest of her short life servicing up to 30 men a day in a windowless cell, barely large enough to lie down in. This wasn't some dark secret of Roman society. It was a cornerstone of their economy. 1 in 3 people in Rome were slaves, and thousands of them existed solely for sexual exploitation. What's truly disturbing isn't just that this happened, but how completely normalised it was. Roman fathers took their sons to brothels staffed by slaves as a coming-of-age ritual. Wealthy matrons kept young male slaves for their private pleasure. Even the great philosopher Seneca, who wrote eloquently about treating slaves humanely, saw nothing wrong with sexual access being part of ownership. This is the story Rome doesn't tell in its marble statues and triumphant arches. How an entire civilization built its leisure and pleasure on the systematic rape of human beings who had no right to say no. Not in the brothels, not in the bedrooms, not anywhere. To understand what Roman sex slaves really endured, we need to strip away 2,000 years of romanticising and face the brutal truth of what it meant to be a body that anyone with money could buy, use, and discard. Above the porni were the deliciae, delights, personal sex slaves in wealthy households. These were typically young boys and girls chosen for exceptional beauty, purchased before puberty, and groomed for their role. They lived better than brothel slaves, but faced their own horrors. Masters had absolute sexual access, using them from childhood through whenever they lost their youthful appeal. The poet Martial wrote casually about his deliciae, a boy named Diaduminus, describing sexual acts with a child in terms that would constitute evidence of pedophilia today, but earned literary praise in Rome. When Delicia aged out of desirability, usually by their late teens, they faced uncertain futures. Some were discarded to brothels. The lucky ones might become regular household slaves. A tiny minority earned freedom through sexual favoritism, though the psychological damage lasted lifetimes. The concubini occupied a strange middle ground, sexual slaves who sometimes developed long-term relationships with their masters. Unlike wives, they had no legal rights, but unlike brothel slaves, they might bear children acknowledged by their fathers. The Emperor Vespasian lived openly with his concubine Caenis for decades. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, kept a concubine after his wife's death. These women walked a tightrope between slavery and quasi-respectability. Their children remained slaves unless specifically freed. They could be sold or discarded at whim. Yet some accumulated influence through sexual relationships, even wealth. The most successful concubini came from educated Greek families, combining sexual availability with cultural refinement that Roman matrons often lacked. They might discuss philosophy while being raped, a grotesque combination that Romans found perfectly normal. Then there were the specialised categories that reveal Rome's particular depravities. The pueri meritori were boy prostitutes, highly valued in a culture where pederasty was commonplace. The spinthri were slaves trained in elaborate sexual performances for orgies and dinner entertainments. The fellatores and cunnilingi were oral sex specialists, considered the most degrading roles because Romans viewed giving oral pleasure as fundamentally shameful. These slaves were often branded on the forehead, marking them permanently as sexual objects. The aquarioli were young slaves who served wine at banquets naked, expected to provide sexual services between courses. Each category had its own pricing, training, and expected lifespan. Few survived past 30. Disease, violence, suicide, and the physical toll of constant rape created a steady demand for fresh slaves to replace the dead. What united all these categories was complete powerlessness. Roman law explicitly stated that slaves could not be raped because rape required the victim to be a person with honour to lose. Slaves were res, things with no more rights than furniture. A master could penetrate any slave of any age in any way without legal consequence. The only restriction was damaging another person's property. If you permanently injured someone else's slave during sex, you might owe compensation, not for the slave's suffering, but for the owner's lost property value. This legal framework created a society where sexual violence was so normalized that Romans couldn't conceive of it as violence. The architect Vitruvius recommended placing slave quarters near furnaces so masters could enjoy warm bodies in winter. Agricultural manuals discussed breeding slaves like livestock. Medical texts described treating injuries from sexual abuse with the same clinical detachment as treating plough horses. The scale defies modern comprehension. Rome had hundreds of licensed brothels and countless unlicensed ones. Every bathhouse offered sexual services through slaves. Every tavern kept slaves for customer use. Wealthy households might own dozens of sex slaves, alongside regular domestic slaves. Even middle-class Romans often owned at least one slave for sexual use. It was considered as normal as owning cooking pots. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of sex slaves in Rome alone, with millions across the empire. Each one a human being reduced to an orifice, a commodity measured in momentary pleasure and resale value. The lucky ones died young. The unlucky ones survived to experience decades of systematic rape, disguised as civilization. The brothel slaves developed survival strategies that break the heart to read about. They gave themselves new names for each customer, creating psychological distance. They formed protective relationships with other slaves when possible, though lenones often forbade friendship to prevent solidarity. Some learned to fake enthusiasm to earn tips they might hide for bribing guards or buying marginally better food. Others retreated so deeply into themselves that Roman writers described them as walking dead. Suicide was common enough that brothels installed bars on windows and removed anything that could be fashioned into a noose. When slaves did manage to kill themselves, their bodies were dumped without ceremony. The financial loss mattered more than the human one. In wealthy households, sex slaves faced different but equally devastating abuse. The appearance of privilege, better food, clothes, even education, came with total availability to not just the master but often his friends and family. Elite Romans hosted dinner parties where sex slaves were passed around like wine cups. The Emperor Tiberius allegedly trained young children he called his little fishes to swim between his legs and nibble his genitals while he bathed. Nero castrated a slave boy named Sporus, dressed him as a woman, and publicly married him. These weren't considered scandals because of the sexual abuse. Only the excessive theatricality bothered contemporaries. The abuse itself was unremarkable. Female sex slaves in elite households navigated additional dangers. Jealous wives might have them tortured or disfigured for attracting their husband's attention, even when the slave had no choice in being raped. If they became pregnant by the master, they faced impossible choices. Some masters acknowledged slave children, raising them with marginally better conditions. Others sold pregnant slaves to avoid complications. Many forced abortions using dangerous herbs or brutal physical methods. The lucky slaves might become wet nurses to legitimate children after giving birth, achieving a reprieve from sexual service. But most were expected back in the master's bed within weeks of delivery, their own babies dead or sold. The psychological damage created multi-generational trauma. Children born to sex slaves often entered the same life, especially if they showed signs of beauty. They grew up witnessing their mother's abuse, knowing their fate. Some masters specifically bred sex slaves like livestock, selecting for appearance and compliance. These verni, house-born slaves, supposedly made better sex slaves because they knew no other life. Roman sources describe this casually, discussing bloodlines and features, like agricultural texts discuss cattle. A Spanish slave might be bred with a Germanic one to produce a child with desired colouring. These children were often sold to other households to prevent incest, not from moral concerns, but because inbreeding reduced market value. Even manumission, freedom, rarely meant escape from sexual exploitation. Freed sex slaves carried stigma that limited options. Many liberti, freed slaves, continued servicing former masters to survive. Others could only find work in brothels, now keeping a portion of earnings but still trapped in prostitution. The law required freed slaves to provide operae, services, to former masters, which often meant continued sexual availability. Women who'd spent their youth in brothels aged out with no skills, no savings, no family. They ended up begging, stealing, or returning to the only trade they knew. Male sex slaves faced similar struggles, plus the additional stigma of having been penetrated, which Romans considered fundamentally emasculating. The lucky few who'd gained education alongside sexual service might become teachers or artisans. But the invisible scars remained. Roman literature occasionally mentions aged former sex slaves, always as objects of disgust or pity, never as humans deserving dignity after lifetimes of abuse. The infrastructure supporting Roman sex slavery reveals a civilization that turned rape into economics. Slave markets operated like stock exchanges, with daily price fluctuations based on supply and demand. War victories flooded markets with cheap slaves, driving down prices. Peaceful periods saw prices rise, encouraging slave traders to raid borderlands for fresh inventory. Specialized dealers called mangones focused exclusively on sex slaves, using techniques that would horrify modern human trafficking investigators. They bleached skin with chemicals to make slaves appear younger or more exotic. They used painful depilation methods to remove all body hair, creating the childlike appearance Romans prized. Teeth were whitened with urine. Scars were hidden with thick makeup. Some dealers specialized in creating eunuchs, castrating boys to preserve youthful features. The survival rate for this surgery was perhaps 50%, but survivors commanded premium prices. The legal system actively protected this industry. Laws regulated brothel locations and operating hours, collected taxes on prostitution, and registered sex slaves in official roles. The aediles, magistrates, inspected brothels not for slave welfare but to ensure proper tax payment. When slaves escaped, the state helped hunt them down. Fugitivus, runaway slaves, faced branding, hamstringing, or crucifixion. The law even addressed edge cases that reveal Roman priorities. If a sex slave injured a customer's penis during service, who paid damages? The slave's owner. If a customer killed a slave during violent sex, what compensation was owed? Market value plus lost future earnings. These weren't theoretical discussions but actual court cases, preserved in legal texts that treat human suffering as property damage. Religion offered no refuge. Roman gods had their own sex slaves in temple prostitution. The cult of Venus, Bacchus, and other deities incorporated ritual sex performed by slaves. Even Christianity, when it emerged, initially accepted slavery, including sexual slavery. Paul's letters tell slaves to obey masters, without distinguishing between labour and sexual service. Not until centuries later did Christian thinkers seriously challenge sexual slavery, and even then more from concerns about spiritual purity than human rights. The sex slaves themselves were barred from most religious participation. They couldn't marry legally, make offerings at many temples, or join burial societies that guaranteed funeral rites. Death brought no dignity. Sex slaves were often dumped in mass graves or left for dogs. Medical texts provide horrifying glimpses into the physical toll. Physicians documented treating vaginal and anal tears, sexually transmitted infections, complications from repeated abortions, and injuries from sexual violence. But treatments focused on returning slaves to service quickly, not healing. One medical text recommends cauterizing tears with hot iron to speed healing. Another suggests doses of silphium, an extinct plant, to prevent pregnancy while warning it could cause fatal hemorrhaging. Psychological trauma wasn't recognized. Physicians noted melancholy or hysteria in sex slaves, but prescribed beatings or starvation to cure it. When slaves became too damaged for use, medical texts advised selling them quickly before conditions worsened visibility. Economics drove everything. A beautiful young slave might cost 2,000 denarii, 2 years' wages for a soldier. Within 5 years of brothel work, her value dropped by 90%. Owners calculated precisely how much abuse would maximize profit before the slave became unsellable. Pregnancy reduced value unless the master wanted breeding stock. Disease made slaves worthless unless concealed until sale. Age was the ultimate depreciation. Most sex slaves were considered used up by 25. The lucky ones transitioned to other household duties. The rest faced abandonment or sale to increasingly desperate buyers. Some ended in underground brothels serving the poorest customers for wine or bread. Others were literally worked to death in mining camps where sex was a side business to breaking rocks. The few preserved voices of sex slaves themselves come filtered through Roman writers who cared more about literary effect than accuracy. But occasionally, authentic horror breaks through. Graffiti in Pompeii includes messages clearly written by sex slaves, thrust slowly, begging for gentleness. "I am yours for 2 asses," advertising with heartbreaking matter-of-factness. One inscription reads, "Africanus is dying in this place," possibly a slave documenting his own slow death. Curse tablets found in Roman ruins include desperate pleas from sex slaves to gods or demons. "Strike down the master, make him impotent, let me die quickly." These fragments hint at an ocean of unrecorded suffering, millions of lives reduced to brief mentions in account books and flesh market receipts. Resistance took forms both subtle and explosive. Sex slaves couldn't rebel openly without facing torture and death, but they found ways to fight back. Some used their intimate access to poison masters. Roman texts warn constantly about slaves doctoring wine or food. Others practiced forms of sabotage, spreading diseases to customers, or damaging property. Brothel slaves sometimes formed secret networks, warning each other about violent customers or sharing techniques to avoid pregnancy. A few learned to forge documents, creating fake manumission papers. Magic and curses provided psychological outlets. Archaeologists have found hundreds of curse tablets clearly created by or for sex slaves, calling divine vengeance on abusers. These small acts of defiance risked everything but preserved some sense of agency in lives otherwise completely controlled. Occasionally, sex slaves achieved freedom through exceptional circumstances. The most famous was Acte, a Greek slave who became Emperor Nero's first love. He lavished gifts on her, tried to marry her, senators barely prevented it, and she accumulated vast wealth. After Nero's suicide, she used that wealth to give him proper burial, when even his family abandoned him. But Acte was literally one in millions. More common were slaves who earned freedom through blackmail. Sex slaves often overheard state secrets or witnessed crimes. Some gained freedom by informing on masters during political purges. Others manipulated emotional attachments, convincing lonely masters to grant deathbed manumissions. But for every success story, thousands died in bondage. The end of Roman sex slavery came slowly and incompletely. Economic changes mattered more than moral evolution. As the empire contracted, war captives became scarcer and more expensive. The rise of serfdom provided alternative labour exploitation. Christian influence eventually discouraged the most public forms of sex slavery, though private abuse continued. The last Roman brothels using slave labour probably closed in the 6th century, 1,000 years after the practice began. But sexual slavery didn't disappear. It transformed, continuing through medieval feudalism into modern human trafficking. The Roman system's efficiency and scale remain unmatched, but its core evil persists wherever humans are bought and sold for sexual use. What made Roman sex slavery particularly horrific was its banality. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was visible, regulated, and completely normalized. Moral philosophers who preached virtue saw no contradiction in raping slaves. Poets who celebrated love owned humans for sexual gratification. Emperors who built architectural wonders did so with wealth extracted from brothels. An entire civilization that gave us law, engineering, and literature also gave us industrialized sexual abuse on a scale hard to comprehend. The slaves themselves, millions of humans reduced to sexual objects, left almost no records. We know them mainly through their absence, silence where voices should be. Modern visitors to Rome walk past locations where brothels operated for centuries, now covered by churches or shops. The Colosseum had brothels in its arcades. The Forum included slave markets where humans were sold for rape. These sites are sanitized now, their horror buried under tourist narratives of imperial glory. But understanding what Roman sex slaves really endured matters. It reminds us that civilization and barbarity can coexist, that legal doesn't mean moral, that humans have infinite capacity to normalize evil. When we romanticize Rome, we erase these millions of victims. They deserve better than silence. The Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years. For every one of those years, in every corner of the Mediterranean world, sex slaves suffered in brothels, bedrooms, and bathhouses. Their pain built fortunes, satisfied citizens, and maintained social order through sexual release valves. The scale staggers, possibly tens of millions of humans subjected to systematic rape over centuries. Each one had a name, a homeland, a life stolen. The 15-year-old Gallic girl from our opening was real. even if we don't know her name. She probably died before 20, her body disposed of without ceremony or marker. She was one of millions whose suffering was considered so normal that Romans couldn't imagine society without it. This wasn't ancient history, it was a blueprint that echoes through time. The methods change, but the evil remains. Humans reduced to objects for sexual gratification. Roman law called slaves speaking tools, and we're not as far from that mindset as we'd like to believe. Modern human trafficking generates billions by selling humans for sex. The average victim today is younger than Roman slaves, the violence often worse. We've outlawed it instead of regulating it, driving it underground rather than into public brothels, but millions still suffer in sexual bondage worldwide. What Roman sex slavery teaches us isn't just about the past, it's about how easily humans rationalize atrocity when it benefits them. Romans weren't uniquely evil. They were people who chose comfort over conscience, who accepted suffering they didn't have to see, who built beautiful things on foundations of human misery. Sound familiar? Every society has its shadows, its accepted evils that future generations will condemn. The question is whether we'll recognize ours before history judges us as harshly as we judge Rome. If this disturbed you, good. It should. History isn't just dates and battles. It's understanding how humans can normalize the unthinkable. Subscribe if you want more uncomfortable truths about the past, the kind that might help us build a better future. Because forgetting these stories doesn't honor the dead. It abandons them twice.